All right, so we're in Matthew 16, verses 13 through 16 is where y'all ended last week.
Oh,
thank you.
Hey, good morning.
go for it.
Okay. All right, so when Jesus had come into the districts of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do men say that the Son of Man is?" And the disciples, responded, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." Jesus said to them, "And you, who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You are the anointed one, the Son of the living God." So then going into this week's passage, Susan, do you have your book?
I have it.
So
Okay.
that's two different questions. The first one is, who do you think the Son of Man is?
No.
And then who do you think I am?
He says, what do people say I am? Who do the people say I am? And now who do you say I am?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Matthew 16:17 starts with, Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood has not revealed this unto you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will remain bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will remain loosed in heaven."
Okay. So Peter says, "You are the anointed one, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon, the son of Jonah, because flesh and blood has not revealed this unto you, but my Father who is in heaven." So this is Jesus telling him, God has spoken to you to give you that. And then he goes on to say that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So there's a lot to unpack in this. So Barclay starts off by pointing out, that this is a key passage for the Catholic Church, because it, Barclay's, this book was written now probably going on close to 60 years ago. And things have evolved a little bit since then in terms of how folks how the different faith bodies view this. I mean, I was raised that I would remember being taught that this is how the Catholic Church came to choose Peter, that he was the first pope, that he's looked upon as being having been the first pope. In looking at my another commentary that I use a lot, the People's Commentary, they made a point about how that this used to be, passage, but the different faith communities, including the Orthodox, the Catholic, Protestants, come now to have a little bit broader view of it, so that some of those views perhaps have evolved over time. So I really want to focus on that the rock, that on this rock, the word rock, and what that all means, because I get into some of this etymology of words. So when Jesus says you are Peter, and on this rock, so there's a play on words, because in Greek, Peter is Petros, Petros, and rock is Petra, Petra.
There you go.
So, and so in Aramaic, Peter's name was Cephas, and that's also means rock. So, so in either language, there's a play on words. And so Jesus is saying, you are, in essence, he's saying, you are Petros, and on this Petra, I will build my church. So, so that word rock has a lot of association with God as well. The rabbis use the word rock, or other faith leaders, should I say.
Rock of Ages.
Rock of Ages, right.
I thought about rock. What Rock of Ages? You know, but that I understand that now.
So I was going to say, there you go, like from My Greek Wedding. So there you go.
Well, now I have a question. That that song, that rock song, kind of rock country. I'm glad my folks named me both Cephas because I'm a guitar playing man. I wonder if that has anything to do with rock.
That makes sense. Rock me, baby. Is that the song you're talking about? Maybe so. Pulling a little faith in there.
Bo
All right.
Cephas. Who was that? Waylon Jennings that was called Bo Cephas?
No.
I see. Who was it?
Hank Williams Jr.
Hank Williams Jr. Yes. I'm glad they named me Bo Cephas because I'm a guitar playing man.
Mhm.
All these biblical characters.
So what? It's everywhere. And there you go.
All right. So rabbis used rock to apply to Abraham. And apparently rabbis had a saying, Barclay says, when the Holy One saw Abraham who was going to arise, he said, lo, I have discovered a rock, Petra, to found the world upon, was a saying that rabbis used. So therefore he called Abraham rock, look unto the rock whence you are hewn. So Abraham was the rock on which the nation and the purpose of God were founded early in the history of the Israelites. And then apparently the word for rock in Hebrew is sur, S-U-R. And Deuteronomy uses the word rock to apply to God. The rock, his work is perfect. In another place in Deuteronomy, indeed, their rock is not like our rock. And in 1 Samuel, there is no rock like our God. In 2 Samuel, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. That phrase sounds familiar, right? And then in Psalm 18, who is a rock besides our God? So lots of imagery of the rock of God being like a rock. So Barclay makes the point that to call anyone a rock was the greatest of compliments, you know, and we all have that, you know, referred to folks who have been a major support to us. You've been my rock, you know. So,
and all these years when people I had rocks in my head, I thought that was a bad thing, and it was actually a compliment.
Has anyone seen the church in Sonoma, Arizona? It's a huge.
Yes, it's Frank Lloyd Wright. My cousin's house is right below that.
Oh dear, if it's the one I'm thinking about, can we go visit? And what is the quotation right inside the church? And it's something about building the church on the rock.
Yeah, I forget. I've been there and seen that, but I forget.
Yeah.
was it built on a rock?
Oh yeah.
It's on the top of a cliff, yeah, overlooking Sedona.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. Huh.
Beautiful.
Good reason for me to go back. I missed it the first time I was at Sedona.
Mm-hmm. Well, you don't want to go back to Sedona.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
All right, so Barclay goes on to talk about what the different meanings that what did, you know, as far as what Jesus meant in this passage when he used the word rock. So Barclay cites Augustine, who took the rock to mean, in Augustine's mind, and Augustine was a early church theologian. so he took the rock to mean Jesus himself, that Jesus was the rock. So as if Jesus was saying, you are Peter, and on myself as rock, I will found my church. And the day will come when the reward of your faith, you will be great in the church. Another explanation is that the rock is the truth, that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God. Because remember, Peter had just said that. All right. You are the anointed one, the Son of the living God.
See the church?
Oh, I've seen pictures of that before. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, pretty.
Cool. All right. So that the truth that Jesus is Son of the living God, that's the rock. A third explanation is that the rock is Peter's faith. On the faith of Peter, the church is founded. But Barclay's favorite interpretation is that Peter himself is the rock, but in a special sense. That he's the first stone of the whole church. That Peter was the first person on earth to discover who Jesus was. He was the first person to make the leap of faith and see in him the Son of the living God. In other words, Peter was the first member of the church, and in that sense, the whole church is built on him. It's as if Jesus said to Peter from Barclay's perspective, Peter, you are the first person to grasp who I am. You are therefore the first stone, the foundation stone, the very beginning of the church, which I am founding. So what do y'all think? What do you think he meant by rock?
Well, I just get that I find that a little confusing, because when Jesus says, when he refers to the cornerstone, he is referring to himself. But then the first stone, being Peter, is different from the cornerstone.
Right, those were four different interpretations that Barclay cited, as far as Jesus saying that, I tell you, Pete, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So those were four different interpretations.
I always thought it was very comforting that Peter was chosen as the foundation of the church when he was clearly an imperfect person. I mean, the scriptures took great pains to lay out all of his shortcomings and weaknesses. And then in spite of all of that, that was the person that God chose to be the foundation of the church. I find that very comforting.
That even though all of his troubles and problems with Peter, that he was the first to admit Jesus, what we say in church every day, Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So but what I was thinking is, was he really the first that said that? Because you'd had a lot of healings going on before this, and people say he has to be the Son of God, to do this. Now Peter might have said, you are the anointed one, you are the Messiah, where other people might not have said that. But I thought I'd heard that before, that people saying he has to be the Son of God after some of the healings, but maybe I'm wrong, because I know that what we're getting here in a lot of these stories is stories pulled from all different times and put together into particular categories.
Right.
And
Now,
summarized.
as far as Jesus being identified by Peter as the Son of God, this is not the first time in Matthew. This passage, or the similar passage in Mark, it is the first time. So each of the gospel writers has put it in a different place in Jesus's ministry. In Matthew, if we go back to Matthew 14:33, and this is when they're out in the boat, all right, remember? And it's the bad storm, and Jesus is walking on the water. it's 3 a.m. He came walking out to them on the sea, and the disciples saw him and they were alarmed. And so Jesus says to them, they were clearly afraid, cried out, but Jesus said to them, "Courage, it is I, don't be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, bid me to come out on the water." And he told Peter to come. Peter got down from the boat, walked on the water to come out to Jesus. The wind came up. He got afraid. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus stretched out his hand and grasped him. "O man of little faith, why did you begin to have doubts?" And when they got back into the boat, the wind sank. And those in the boat who were disciples knelt in reverence before him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So the disciples had said that in Matthew back in 14 after seeing Jesus walk on the water, and Peter got out there with him. So that's how Matthew's presenting it. I did want to interject a little bit, and if Sarah talked about this last time, then tell me. But to talk a little bit about the term, we're on Son of God. Wait a minute, never mind. I'll do that in a little bit when we get to talk about Son of Man. All right. So any other thoughts about Peter as the rock and his seeing or understanding Jesus?
Yeah. He was hard-headed too, I guess.
We don't know anybody else who was hard-headed, do we?
No.
No. So Nancy, going back to what you were saying, yeah, to look at Peter over the course of the Gospels and his faith journey, how he worked at figuring this out, and forward and back, forward and back, forward and back. It's not unlike our own faith journeys. So Peter led the way for us in more than one way. So,
You want to read the next one?
all right, so I want to talk a little bit about Jesus's use of the word church, because this is the first time he uses the word church. All right, and what that means. So church didn't necessarily mean the physical buildings at that point, didn't mean that. While later in the New Testament, we do get more of that sense of when the word church is used as referring to a building. There are a lot of purposes. Here, Peter is the foundation in the sense he's the one person for whom the whole church is built. But he was the first person to discover who Jesus was. So church is a little bit broader perspective right here. Ephesians refers to the prophets and apostles to be the foundation of the church. And also that Jesus Christ is the chief cornerstone in Ephesians, as the force that holds the church together. So Barclay goes on to make the point that when Jesus said to Peter that on him he would found his church, he didn't mean that the church depended on Peter as it depended on himself and God, the rock. He did mean that the church began with Peter. In that sense, Peter's the foundation of the church. And then church also, in the Greek word for church is ecclesia. So, you hear the term ecclesiastical to refer to things that are related to the church. So needless to say, that's where it comes from, ecclesia. So we're apt to think of the church as an institution. The Hebrew word that Barclay says Jesus almost certainly used was kahal, which in the Old Testament means the congregation of Israel. So Barclay's interpretation is that Peter, you are the beginning of the new Israel, the new people of the Lord, the new fellowship of those who believe in my name. So Peter was the first of the fellowship of believers in Christ. So with what began with Peter was the fellowship of all believers in Jesus Christ, not identified with any church and not limited to any church, but embracing all who love the world, who love the Lord. So that universal, beyond any denomination, the Catholic with a small c, which means that universal church that's above all denominations or sects or orthodoxy or whatever. So Peter is that foundation for that universal church.
What was that Hebrew word again in the definition?
Kahal, Qahal. And the definition, the congregation of Israel. It was a word used in the Old Testament, meaning the congregation of Israel. So whether, we've talked before in previous discussions about, did Jesus really intend for there to be, Orthodox Church, Catholic with a big C, all the Protestant denominations? What was Jesus's intent? As far as the church?
It was clearly something new, because Peter was the foundation of something new. So it wasn't referring to the old Israel, but to explore the idea of the new Israel. That was very interesting to me.
But would the new Israel then simply mean those who accept Jesus as the Messiah, as the anointed one?
Right, and Jesus brought the new covenant also. So, did Jesus intend, even in early Christianity, was there an early intent for the church to become separate from Judaism?
Oh, I think definitely, because it all hinges upon, do you accept Jesus as the Christ? And that is the new concept.
So did he intend an institution, or did he intend a way of life?
I think it's definitely a way of life, because when he says, when they said, your mother and your brothers are waiting outside, and he said, who are my mother and my brothers? Those who, do the Lord's work are my mother and my brothers.
It was definitely a major reset, because we got away from the covenant and not following all the rules, and it was a major paradigm shift. And I think Jesus must have realized that not everybody was going to get on the train, because there were those people who, the old system worked very well for them, but it didn't for a lot of people.
Right, and he said that when that happens, wipe the dust off your feet and move on. Wipe the dust from that town and move on. I don't know, food for thought, and I think, the disciples in the last 50, 60 years have provided a tremendous amount of leadership in, bridging between the different denominations. I assume there still is, or there had been for a long time, very distinct discussions between the disciples and the Catholic Church. And the disciples provided a tremendous amount of leadership to an ecumenical group back during the 60s and 70s called the Council on Church Unity. We've also provided a lot of leadership for our relative size to the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches. So these very broad ecumenical efforts to find the common ground that there is between all of us. You know, there may be differences in some theology and some religious practices, but overall, that when you get down to what the basic rock is, there's a lot of common ground. In my mind, that's my mind. That's my soapbox.
Wasn't it relatively recently that the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church started meeting and talking and sort of collaborating? That hasn't been that long ago they started that, I don't think.
No, think back to Pope John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, to his funeral. There were leaders from every major Christian faith at all the Orthodox, representing Protestants as well, at his funeral and participated in his funeral. So, I mean, to me, that says a tremendous amount about the work that the Catholic Church has been doing. You know, it was doing, and I think Pope Francis is doing similar. He's trying to reform the Catholic Church. But, so at, you know, finding that common ground, because there's a tremendous amount of common ground, you know. So back in the spring during Lent, I inadvertently, I ended up participating in a study of the Psalms that 7th Street Christian Church did with one of the synagogues there in the West End, and this name escapes me. But that was fascinating to have conversations with Jews and Christians, you know, looking at Psalms, and it was a fascinating process about, you know, a huge amount of common ground we had.
Jack Spiro involved with that?
No, no, it was the rabbi, he and Holly Woodruff, who's the minister at 7th Street, he and her, they've done a lot of, you know, conversations with each other, and they were the ones that led the study. So, but it was fascinating. So
I have an uncle who was a Baptist minister, and when my father was growing up, I think they were either Methodist or Presbyterian or something, I don't know what, but his mother was so upset that her son became a Baptist minister. You know, that was just, oh my Lord, you know, he's hanging out with those Baptists, we've got to do something.
well, we all grew up with that kind of,
Yeah.
you know, in some way or another, you know. So, I mean, I remember moving to Richmond and being fascinated by how many Catholic churches there were, because there was one in Winston-Salem, you know? And so that was like the folks on the other side of the track, you know, where there's Catholics. So my mother had grown up in a Catholic neighborhood in Pittsburgh, so, you know, so I got a little broader perspective than a lot of my friends had. All right, so speaking of perspective, moving on to another key piece of this passage, because Jesus says, I will tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. All right, so from this comes the sort of common image that we get to the gates of heaven and Peter's going to be there to let us in, right? Well, that's not what this verse says. So I will give you the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. All right, so wait a minute, keys of heaven. I jumped ahead of myself, sorry. My brain is not quite in gear today, so y'all gonna have to, I slept 10 hours last night for some weird reason, and my brain's not quite all the way awoken. So anyhow, the gates of Hades. All right, so what does that mean, that the gates of Hades will not prevail against his church?
I think it's just simply that evil won't win.
Yeah, that Jesus has overcome death and, you know, Satan, and he is above all. He has he is already victorious.
Cool. All right. Well, Barclay, of course, has to add some things. So he talks about how the gate at a little village in town was, there was apparently traditionally a gate, and that was the place where the elders and rulers would meet and dispel justice. So it was a place of governance.
Down here as a person in our Sunday school. Susan.
Yep.
Sorry.
Susan, you're on. Yep. All right. So, so anyhow, gates of Hades is, can raise an imagery of a fortress. Another possibilities that were in primitive Jewish belief, Hades was not a place of punishment. All right. All right. But I muted the BACC computer. Hades was not a place of punishment, but a place where all the dead went. That initially, that's what Hades was about, that's where all the dead went. So a gate would be, obviously the function of a gate would be to keep things in. So there was one person whom the gate of Hades could not shut in, and that was Jesus Christ. He burst the bonds of death. Okay. So in Acts says in Acts 2, God freed him from death, freed Jesus, because it was impossible for him to be held in its power. You will not abandon my soul to Hades or let my Holy One experience corruption. So, so Barclay makes the point that this phrase triumphantly expresses the indestructibility of Christ and his church. All right, so now moving on, anything you want to add about the gates of Hades, the gates of hell? All right, so the keys of the kingdom. So now we're at that image of Peter greeting us at the pearly gates and saying, yes, you can come in. No, you can't come in. So the keys of the kingdom, which Barclay identifies as being a difficult phrase. So that the phrase signified a very special kind of power that the rabbis had another saying, the keys of birth, of the reign, of the resurrection of the dead belong to God. That rabbis would say that. So that only God has the power to create life, to send the rain, raise the dead. So indicating a special power. The keys of the kingdom is a phrase that in several other places in the New Testament is tied to Jesus. In Revelation, the risen Christ says, I am the living one. I was dead, and see, I'm alive forever and ever. I have the keys of death and of Hades, is what it says in Revelation. And another place in Revelation 3, that was Revelation 1. In Revelation 3rd chapter, the risen Christ was described as the Holy One, the true one, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens. So, and then going back to Isaiah, Barclay says that these New Testament phrases and usages remind folks of Isaiah, where he described Eliakim, who will have the key of the house of David on his shoulder, and who alone will open and shut. And the duty of Eliakim was to be the faithful steward of the house. So that's another imagery, to be a faithful steward of the house. And Peter did that. At Pentecost, he opened the door to 3,000 souls. He opened the door to the Gentile centurion Cornelius. In Acts 15, when there was the Council of Jerusalem, that opened the door, and Peter was obviously a leader in that. That opened the door to Gentiles for the church. But Barclay goes on to make the point, but it's not only Peter who has the keys of the kingdom, every Christian has. For it is open to every one of us to open the door of the kingdom, to some other, and so to enter into the great promise of Christ. It's Barclay's interpretation of that. So after Jesus says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, he goes on to say, and whatever you bind on earth will remain bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will remain loosed in heaven. That was kind of a confusing phrase in there for me, sentence. So Barclay gives some explanation about that. That another commentator he cites, that Barclay cites, took this to mean that Peter would lay people's sins, bind them to their consequences, and that he would then loose them from their sins by telling them of the love and forgiveness of God. So people would be bound by their sins and then loosed. But to loose and to bind were very common Jewish phrases. They were used especially of the decisions of great teachers and great rabbis. So their regular sense, which any Jew would recognize, was to allow and to forbid. So the phrases were to declare it forbidden, to loose it was to declare it allowed. So to bind was forbidden, to loose was to allow. So that made a little bit more sense. So Barclay paraphrases this to say, Peter, you're going to have grave and heavy responsibilities laid upon you. You're going to have to take decisions which will affect the welfare of the whole church. You will be the guide and director of the infant church. And the decisions you give will be so important that they will affect the souls of men and women in time and eternity. So the privilege of the keys, meaning he would be the steward of the household of God. So that was a little different perspective for me. What are y'all's thoughts about the keys of the kingdom?
Barclay's interpretation would scare the bejesus out of me. Nothing like a little pressure.
I was just thinking, what a responsibility to lay on someone.
All right, wait till we get to this next passage. See what Peter does. Talk about that. Steps forward, steps back. We got another step back coming up here. Yeah, so it is. It's a lot, and it was. I mean, we still talk about Peter as the rock of the church. So how we interpret that. So hopefully this discussion has kind of broadened our perspective about Peter as the rock. So, all right, so but moving on to the next passage, talk about, all right, as far as what Peter does. So this is chapter 16, verses 20 through 23. He, Jesus, gave orders to his disciples to tell no one that he was God's anointed one. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised on the third day. But Peter caught hold of him and began to urge him, God forbid that this should happen to you. This must never come to you. Jesus turned to Peter and said, Get behind me, Satan. You are putting a stumbling block in my way. Your ideas are not God's, but men's. So we go from, you're the rock, the gates of Hades will not prevail against you as the rock. I will give you the keys of the kingdom. And then he's like, get behind me, Satan. So, maybe the way this passage is written, it sounds like it could have happened at a point later in time, not necessarily that same day, that it could have been a passage of time. But to think, these two passages, one right after the other. So even though the disciples are getting it that you're the Son of God, they're still seeing, the Messiah as the traditional, being a warrior king, a conquering Messiah. Barclay is saying that still seeing it in that way. So still trying to figure out what this all means. So for Jesus, and saying to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." When was the other time that Jesus spoke directly to Satan? Here's your Bible.
When he was tempted in the
temptations.
wilderness.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. So, and at that time, what was Satan tempting Jesus with? What was he trying to tempt Jesus with?
He could rule the world.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so Peter is saying, this shouldn't happen to you. You shouldn't die. They shouldn't do those things to you. It must never come true. Because they're apparently still that image of the conquering Messiah. And Jesus still continues to try to teach them what that's going to be like.
I think that's true, but I also think they were very attached to him on a personal level. And it would be just as if one of your friends came up to you and said, "I'm going to die next Thursday." You would say, "Oh, God forbid that can't happen," because you can't bear the thought of losing them.
Right. Yeah, I've wondered that too. I wonder how much that's an aspect of what Peter had to say too. Yep. All right. So the word Satan, that word literally means the adversary. All right. So not necessarily, so the adversary meaning what? What does adversary mean?
Someone who goes against your plans or impedes your progress.
Right. Barclay makes the point, someone that deflects us from the way of God. So any influence which seeks to make us turn back from the hard way that God has set before us. Any power which seeks to make human desires take the place of the divine imperative. So with Peter making that statement, no, this can't happen to you, it makes that temptation more acute. So he says, "Satan, get behind me." Early theologian Origen, "Peter, your place is behind me, not in front of me." This may be a way of Jesus saying that to Peter, because he's just said to him, you're going to have the keys of the kingdom. But it's almost like he's putting Peter, getting this hierarchy straight, that his head doesn't get too big, so to speak. "Peter, your place is behind me, not in front of me. Your place is to follow me in the way I choose, not to lead me in the way you would like me to go." That was Origen's thought. So recalling the temptation from the desert. So Barclay interprets it as Jesus saying to Peter, at the point that you have spoken, at the moment you have spoken as Satan would, but that's not the real Peter speaking. You can redeem yourself, come behind me and be my follower again. And even now, all will be well. So Barclay's wondering if that's maybe what he was trying to say to Peter. Oh. Any other comments or thoughts you'd like to add? right, moving on to the next passage. We've got a couple more minutes. And it's a big one. And I don't want to give it up. I want to spend just 2 minutes on it because it's about, for what shall a man be profited if he shall gain the whole world at the penalty of the price of his own life? And what will a man give in exchange for his life? It's more deep thought. And we've had my brain's kind of full of deep thoughts right now. So.
Well, thank you for a very lovely lesson, Kathy. It's a lot to think about.
It is. And the more we do this and the more I keep saying this, what impact it has to go back and read the passages as a whole, to go back and read like 13, 14, 15, and 16 at one reading, spend about 10 or 15 minutes reading and see the progression of how Matthew puts these things together. So it's kind of interesting. So I hope each of you has a blessed week. Stay safe.